After experiencing a brief economic contraction from 1921 to 1922, the United States quickly welcomed another period of prosperity, the Roaring Twenties. Unlike Europe, ravaged by the fires of World War I and facing industrial recession, post-WWI America was the only truly healthy industrial nation in the world at the time, as large numbers of soldiers carrying cash returned home, reinvigorating the commodity and labor markets, and as wartime military factories gradually converted to civilian use. The federal government implemented a liberal economic policy, coupled with various stimulating factors such as the shift from high wartime tax rates to low post-war rates. The American economy once again burst forth with strong momentum, mass industrial production, the invention of numerous new technologies, the prevalence of consumerism, the expansion of infrastructure, the development of mass media, and the intense collision of old and new cultures were all notable social characteristics of the Roaring Twenties. Over the course of this period, 19,201,929 US GDP rose from $88.4 billion in 1920, rising to $103.6 billion in 1929, achieving an average annual growth rate of 1.6%. Besides the United States, the economies of other countries during the 1920s also experienced varying degrees of rapid development. France, for example, benefited from post-war American loans and German reparations, allowing its economy to recover and grow. The French referred to this period as the Anus Folle's crazy years. In Germany, since it accepted the Dawes Plan, obtaining American aid and a postponement of war reparations payments, Germany also experienced a relatively prosperous period. This era was known there as the Golden Twenties, However, this era, hailed as the most colorful age in history, concealed numerous risks behind its dazzling appearance that were overlooked by most. America's economy lacked diversity, being overly reliant on the construction and automobile industries, unequal distribution of purchasing power, and a widening wealth gap. Along with the economy's excessive dependence on speculation and credit, or perhaps the excessive spending driven by prevalent consumerism, where people overextended their consumption to maintain affluent lifestyles. This entire series of social phenomena seems to have already signaled the instability of this boom. It is unclear whether any Americans at the time recognized the irregularities behind the facade of prosperity, but clearly, the then-sitting US President Hoover did not detect the approaching crisis. In 1929, signaled by a bull market that had been running strong for over half a year, suddenly showing consecutive massive drops on October 28th and 29th that year, a great economic panic arrived. Although even before the collapse of this bull market, the US stock market had already experienced several severe shocks. Financial institutions, such as JP Morgan Chase, had even intentionally boosted stock prices to restore public confidence. President Hoover, meanwhile, claimed that the fundamental economic condition is sound, and the American people should maintain confidence and courage. But clearly, these efforts to save the market ultimately failed. After the stock market collapsed, a series of chain reactions began, instantly detonating the long-standing weaknesses of the American economy and profoundly affecting the entire world. Due to the stock price crash, many margin investors, seeing their assets instantly evaporate, began defaulting on bank loans, severely damaging bank assets and credibility. This was especially true for banks that had previously acted recklessly, investing heavily in the stock market or providing bad loans. As the risks faced by banks began to surface, depositors, seeking to mitigate risk, started panicking and withdrawing deposits, subsequently causing banks' cash flows to become extremely strained. Amidst the wave of bank runs between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks in the US failed, resulting in deposit losses exceeding $25 billion. The bank failure wave, coupled with the constraints of the gold standard and the Federal Reserve's passive response policy, led to a sharp decrease in the domestic money supply in the US, which fell by 1/3 in 3 years. Following the decline in money supply, purchasing power also decreased concurrently. American society consequently plunged into a state of deflation. Between 1929 and 1932 US, GDP dropped from $103.6 billion to $58.7 billion, an average annual decline exceeding 15. Government investment in infrastructure fell from $16.2 billion in 1929 to $300 million in 1933. Over the four-year period, the US Consumer Price Index dropped by and the Wholesale Price Index dropped by 32. Total farm income fell from $12 billion to $5 billion. When it rains, it pours. The US, amidst economic recession, also suffered from a very severe drought starting in 1930. This drought, known as the Black Blizzard Incident Dust Bowl, brought massive destruction to the agriculture of the southern and western Great Plains. The drought, lasting nearly 10 years, turned once fertile farms into deserts. Over 3 million people were forced to leave their homes due to the drought. Most of them did not return to their original states until after the Depression ended, although the drought was severe due to previous overproduction. The US agricultural economy during the Great Depression remained in a state of surplus supply. The resulting effect was that low-priced agricultural products not only failed to yield any benefit to growers, they also forced many farmers to leave their previous jobs and move to cities in search of new employment opportunities. But clearly, urban life was also not optimistic. In the depressed economic environment, factories and shops in cities took drastic measures to survive. They lowered commodity prices, cut production, and laid off workers. During the Great Depression, US unemployment remained stubbornly high. In 1929, the number of unemployed Americans was 1.5 million. But by 1933, this number had soared to 12 million. The unemployment rate that year, reaching 24.9, was the highest recorded unemployment rate in US history. Unemployed Americans could not afford rent, utilities, and other basic expenses. Homeless people were ubiquitous across the US at the time. These people, to reflect their poverty and dissatisfaction, named the makeshift, dilapidated shantytowns Hoovervilles. Also due to the scarcity of jobs. Racial tensions within the US were further aggravated during the Great Depression. In southern cities, white people demanded the dismissal of all black workers to reserve jobs for whites. They used intimidation and violence to drive out black people, forcing them to quit their jobs. Data shows that in 1932, half of the black population in the South was unemployed. The harsh living environment also led to the migration of nearly 400,000 Southern black people to the North during the 1930s, although racial discrimination in the North was not as severe as in the South. The conditions here were not much better than in the South. In New York, the unemployment rate for black people reached 50, and in some cities, it was even higher. The American public certainly had reason to blame their national leader, Herbert Hoover. This man, who before taking office proclaimed that America today was closer than any other country in the world, at any time in history, to achieving the goal of eliminating poverty, unexpectedly faced immediate failure just half a year after taking office. Facing the Great Depression, the Hoover administration did not do nothing. They did try hard to address this crisis, but they just did not achieve much effect. As early as April 1929, that is, before the stock market crash, faced with the already distressed agricultural economy, Hoover proposed the Agricultural Marketing Act. In an attempt to solve the problems of agricultural oversupply and low prices, Hoover also tried to protect American farmers from international competition through tariffs. The Holysmooth Tariff Act, passed in 1930, also increased the prices of 75 types of agricultural products. However, these two laws not only failed to solve the farmers' problems later on, they even caused a great deal of food waste. Meanwhile, in Depression-era America, millions of people were starving at the time. In order to salvage the public's confidence in the economy, in 1930, Hoover also convened leaders of industry, agriculture, and commerce at the White House. pleading with them not to cut production or lay off workers and to maintain stable wages and prices, and voluntarily accept a plan aimed at economic recovery. However, as the economic situation further deteriorated in 1931, this strategy, which excessively pursued individualism, liberty, and social balance, a strategy lacking mandatory and binding force, also ended in bankruptcy. Also, starting in 1931, due to the economic recession in the United States, US banks began to successively reduce loans to European countries. This caused the financial systems of some European countries, which previously relied heavily on new loans granted by US banks, to repay old debts, to begin to collapse. Coupled with high US tariff protection, European products were difficult to sell in the US market. European countries, lacking funds to pay their loans, began to default in large numbers, and the collapse of the international credit structure subsequently became one of the important reasons for the spread of the American Great Depression to Europe. Furthermore, it laid a profound hidden danger for the worsening of future international situations. Because the voluntary cooperation plan failed to work, the Hoover administration then attempted to deal with the Great Depression through government spending. The president suggested Congress increase government spending to $423 million. To be used for investment in public works, construction. Although this amount was not a small sum at the time, it was still unrealistic to solve the Great Depression using this funding. In fact, when the economic situation became worse, Hoover, in order to balance government revenue and expenditure, also reduced investment in public infrastructure. In 1932, to avoid a budget deficit, Hoover comprehensively raised various tax rates. The resulting outcome was a further reduction in the purchasing power of consumers and businesses, and the economy further contracted as a result. Between 1929 and 1932, the US federal government's budget deficit did indeed decrease from $580 million to $350 million. But the cost was that government fiscal revenue, which was $3.85 billion in 1929, shrank to $1.96 billion in 1932, a reduction of nearly half. Clearly, within this vicious cycle, the measure of raising tax rates not only failed to solve the primary problem of the economic recession, but also further intensified the economic crisis and social dissatisfaction. 1932, another year for the presidential election. The once complacent Herbert Hoover looked despondent at this moment. The somber atmosphere at the convention seemed to foreshadow that Hoover would not be re-elected, and it was precisely because of Hoover's unpopularity that a Manon aristocrat from the Hudson Valley, a distant relative of President Theodore Roosevelt, named Franklin D. Roosevelt, gained the advantage needed to win this election. In the November election, Roosevelt won by an absolute advantage, securing 57.4% of the popular vote. Moreover, Roosevelt held an overwhelming advantage in the Electoral College votes. On March 4, 1933, a cheerful Roosevelt and a gloomy Hoover rode together along the roads of Pennsylvania. Moments later, Roosevelt was sworn in as the 32nd President of the United States. So, would the arrival of this new leader meet the expectations of Americans? Would the cheerful sentiment of his inauguration spread to all Americans in the future?